Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today for the second of our series with conservative thought leaders looking at divided government and specifically the Republican House and how it might work with a Democratic White House. Joining me today is Rick Dearborn, former White House Deputy Chief of Staff to President Donald Trump and a BPC Fellow. He is currently a partner at Mindset, bringing 3 decades of experience that includes service under 2 U.S. presidents, 6 U.S. senators. And in his role as Deputy Chief of Staff, he was responsible for the day-to-day operations of approximately 100 staff in 5 separate executive offices of the presidential departments. He was executive director of the 2016 presidential transition team, was responsible for the direction and management of the transition team's 600 plus members. He's previously served as Senator Jeff Sessions for over 2 decades, both as his chief of staff and legislative director. Joining Rick and I is also Tevi Troy. Tevi Troy is a senior fellow here at the BPC and a former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, a best-selling presidential historian. His latest book is Fight House: Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump, named one of 2020's top political books by the Wall Street Journal. As Deputy Secretary, Dr. Troy was the Chief Operating Officer of the largest civilian department in the federal government, with a budget of $716 billion and over 16,000 employees. He is also a veteran of the Senate. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to have this conversation, and there's endless topics to cover. So I'm going to jump in and ask you both just to give our viewers a little bit of background about yourself. Rick, you obviously served a long time on the Hill and then went over to the White House, as many of us Washington politicos do. How was that experience? What kind of experience did you bring from Capitol Hill to the White House, and how was that transition?
It was different. I'd worked in other White Houses before, not necessarily in the White House like Tevi in the Bush administration, but I'd worked at the Department of Energy as an assistant secretary of congressional affairs. But I had 30 years of experience in the Senate. I worked for 7 different senators, had been a chief of staff, a legislative director, had worked on, helped write a lot of legislation. I guess what helped me the most is I did have legislative affairs as one of the divisions that was under my supervision as a deputy chief of staff. I had a great legislative affairs team. Early on, it was really important for us to try to notch a lot of victories. I think it came in really handy, that legislative experience, the Senate experience, and the House experience that I got when I was in the Bush administration working with the House. I think that helped us with the Trump tax cut program in 2017. I was able, I think, really to use a lot of my experience and connectivity with folks on the Hill to try to help work with our legislative team to get that passed. But it was a very different White House. It ran differently. Tevi and I would probably be the first to tell you it was very different than a more buttoned up version of the Bush White House. And we can probably get into that here in a little bit too.
Great. And so speaking of White Houses, Tevi, you have made a career of looking at the presidency. You got your most recent book. Tell us a little bit about why focus on the presidency.
Well, I've been fascinated with the presidency from a very early age. I used to get those young reader books where they would describe different presidents. And I just thought it was cool. There's one person who's basically in charge of the country, who gets to shape the direction of the nation, is the face of the nation. And so I studied in graduate school the presidency. I got a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. I spent a lot of time in the LBJ library, and I've been working on presidential books pretty much ever since. I've written 4 books on the presidency over a 2-decade period, with a 5th one on the way. They all cover different aspects of the presidency. I looked at intellectuals in the presidency. I looked at disasters and how presidents have handled those. I looked at pop culture interests in the presidency. My last book, as you said, was about infighting in the White House, and talked a lot about process, which I know Rick and I want to talk about today. And so I coupled that academic experience with time in government, but I also had 5 years in the Bush White House, where I was in cabinet affairs. I was in the Domestic Policy Council. I worked with the Office of Public Liaison. So I really understood the inner workings of the White House, having had that academic background, and then also have that practical experience in the White House. And I bring those together in my writing and my work with the Bipartisan Policy Center.
So obviously we've got the exact right folks to have this conversation today. So we have, obviously there's a Republican House, Democratic Senate, Democratic White House. And in the recent run up to the debt ceiling crisis, regardless of why we got into that crisis point. The negotiation was really between the McCarthy House and the Biden White House. And so, Rick, I know that there was some, Speaker McCarthy had to go through several votes to get to the speakership. A lot of folks thought he might be weakened because of that battle, but he kind of came out and got the upper hand in the budget negotiation. He got a bill through the House when I think some people doubted that could happen. What do you attribute that success to?
Yeah, I guess it goes back to the 15 votes for speaker, right? I mean, it was a long, drawn out process. There were demands placed on him. He had to work with every single corner of his conference. He had a group of 20 plus that had multiple things that they were hopeful to get as part of their support for his speakership. And I think he probably tries to focus on running the House one day at a time. I mean, he's got very little margin of error. He's got a handful of folks that give him the majority in the House. And I think he does a really good job by listening to folks. One thing about this speaker that might be different from others is that a lot of times when the new House comes in and there's the vote for the speakership, it's a formality. There's enough votes to pass it that speaker has, 15, 20, maybe even close to 30 votes margin over the minority. Well, that gives that speaker a lot of room to maneuver and find the votes that they actually need to pass legislation, to get things through committees, et cetera. There's very little margin of error for Speaker McCarthy. And I think if anything, he's calling on all the gifts that he has to work with all these members. I was at a recent event with him and he said something at this reception about, look, I'm gone 250 days out of a 365-day calendar year, and I'm in the backyards of every one of my members. And he's not just raising money. He's there for events. He's there because, they need him to kind of wave the flag and show that they've got some pull with their own, leadership. And let's face it, the debt deal was, I think, a Herculean task for him. It did indeed ruffle the feathers of a lot of conservatives who wanted to see greater spending cuts. But I think that the leadership really took the time to talk with each of the groups. They've talked to them about how they want to achieve more spending cuts. There have been a couple of hiccups in recent weeks where the conservatives have reminded the leadership, where they've had rules that they brought down because they had concerns over some of the things that happened in the debt bill. But he's taking the time with his leadership team to really work that out. A lot of our most recent past speakers have kind of run the House with an iron fist, but I really see this leadership effort as a team effort. I mean, I think that McCarthy is able to rely on an entire leadership team. So they work as a unit. I mean, I talk to these guys a lot. I'm an old Senate guy, but the House is where the fun is. It's very raucous. I mean, everybody wears their passion on their sleeve. Things happen quickly, but the speaker and the leader and the whip, and along with some of the senior advisors that they have, they bring in the Freedom Caucus, they sit them down in the room, they meet with the committee chairs and the leadership. They do the same with the moderates. They try to get the moderates in the room with the conservatives too and talk so that all sides of the conference have a say in what they're trying to do, and that the speaker and the leader and his team are all listening to their members. So they're not really ruling or able to rule with an iron fist. But let's face it, look, I mean, the top two guys, McCarthy and Scalise, are both former whips. I think they still think like whips, which I think helps them work with their colleagues because they're always thinking through, how do I get that vote? What does this member need? How are we going to move? How are we going to move the ball? So I think the conference and the work that they do at the conference is something that they have to pay attention to on a daily basis. It's not like McCarthy can set an agenda and it's just going to be on autopilot. They have to work for every single one of these votes because they have no margin of error. So what they did, I think, in the debt deal was truly Herculean. It's a tribute to him and his leadership team. And there's still more work to do. And I think the conservatives have made that clear that they'd like to see more spending cuts.
So I want to touch on the repercussions of the vote in a minute. But first, I want to talk to Tevi a little bit about McCarthy's partner in all this was the president, Joe Biden, who came into office with a great reputation as a legislator. He'd spent obviously 30 some years in the Senate, knew how to pass legislation and work with the other side. How did that experience play out in these budget negotiations and truthfully in the last few months of his negotiating with the other side?
Yeah, thanks. First, I think Rick made some terrific points and happy to discuss more of those a little later. But in terms of Biden, I think given that reputation he had as some kind of bipartisan deal maker, I think he's been a disappointment as president. And I think so on a number of levels. First of all, he had this big reputation. He's got a friendship with Mitch McConnell. He's friends with the late Bob Dole and visited him in his apartment before he died. So he has this great reputation. But I just don't think it's borne out as president. He's done a number of things that I think have been disappointing. He decided to go it alone in a unipartisan way on some of those early spending and stimulus bills. I also think that his rhetoric has been really destructive. I didn't like the Bull Connor speech where he compared people who disagreed with him to Bull Connor and Jefferson Davis. That ruffled a lot of Republican feathers. He gave that talk, the Red Room address, where he basically conflated what he sees as the MAGA Republicans or the ultra MAGA Republicans, and the way he described them were everyday regular Republicans who may not have that MAGA designation. And so I think rhetorically, Biden has been in a problematic position as president. And I think it is contrary to his longstanding reputation as a conciliator. Now, it gets to the specifics of this budget negotiation. I just think he made a strategic mistake where he said, I'm not going to negotiate. The American people said, well, that's ridiculous. First of all, you claimed your whole career to be a negotiator. Second of all, why aren't you going to negotiate? This is the biggest issue that's out there. We need to get this debt ceiling issue resolved. And you're just claiming you're not going to negotiate. It wasn't a viable position. And I think the Democrats eventually realized that. And they even would walk it back. They said, well, we didn't actually say we're not going to negotiate. But no, he specifically said multiple times, I'm not going to negotiate. And that's not what the American people want. They know Republicans and Democrats are in different places. And I get that. And we have differences on policy, serious differences on policy. But if you're going to say you're not going to negotiate, well, that's just not a mark of a serious political person. You have to have a negotiation because we don't have a one-size-fits-all system. We don't have one party rule. We don't have a parliamentary system. The way you're going to get stuff done is through negotiation. Joe Biden has claimed his whole political career to be a bipartisan conciliator and negotiator. And I think he just put himself out too far on the ledge, both with his rhetoric leading up to the negotiation situation or the debt ceiling situation, and then with his really untenable, unviable position that he wasn't going to negotiate. So I think McCarthy played it well, and I think Biden made a mistake.
Great. So looking at the agreement itself, passes bipartisan votes. And now, as you alluded to earlier, Rick, we've had the far right conservatives in the House have revolted. We've heard some rumblings that some of the Republicans back home who voted for the bill are taking some heat. So first, how does McCarthy bring the party back together? And how do we move forward from this? And then what does this sort of pushback we're getting back home for Republicans, how does that speak towards future agreements? So Rick, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what does McCarthy do now when they come back in 2 weeks?
Yeah. Look, let's go straight to the biggest point, which is all of this was designed so they could push this thing past the election. And I think the deal runs through January of 2025. It sets spending limits. The House is now marking to actually much lower levels. A lot of the bills are at levels that are even lower than what was in the debt deal. So I think he's trying to address it by trying to talk to his conservatives and those who were really concerned about the spending over the last several years, and especially through COVID and since President Biden came in, and wanted to see deeper cuts, especially in non-defense discretionary spending. But my point would be that a shutdown is possible. I'm sure you'll probably ask us a question about that. But I think where we are is that leadership is being honest with its members. And I think what they're saying is that whatever's going to wind up leaving the House isn't going to be what's ultimately signed into law. It has to pass through the Senate. So I think they're trying to be as practical and open with the different groupings of the caucus as they possibly can. You get Garrett Graves in charge of kind of the emissary to the so-called five families, which are the different groups of House Republicans, be it the study committee or Main Street folks or governance council or problem solvers or even the Freedom Caucus. So, he has to connect with all of those. He's been asked to by McCarthy to do that. But I think that they're meeting with them constantly. Tevi and I were talking a little bit before we came on about process. Process is important. Well, process is important to everybody. It's just as important to the 20 plus folks that McCarthy is having to deal with on a constant basis to try to get things moving in the House. But I think he's been pretty straightforward, he and the leadership team, that talking to them and walking through what those expectations should be is kind of what the key is. I guess the marker for them is this. They have about I think they have 4 more bills really to get done and through in July. But the process of getting their appropriations bills done on the House side is what I believe leadership and even the caucus sees as the best next step to help them with what the ultimate negotiations on spending will be as we get closer to the end of September. If all of those bills pass marked at the levels that the House wants, then I think the House and all the elements of the House will be in a stronger position for those negotiations, and probably better positioned so that you would be in a better place to start those negotiations with the Senate and with the White House. If we don't get all the bills passed by July, then I think that the shutdown worries are going to wind up. You're going to start hearing a lot more talk about that. So I think right now the biggest focus is that what can we accomplish? What can we get done? Let's get the appropriations bills done. When we come back from this July 4th recess period, they're also going to go to the defense bill. So for him, it's let's legislate, let's get our guys, let's give them the amendment process. Let's give them a chance to voice their concerns. All of that creates a kind of a dynamic situation for McCarthy. But look, he's going to have to be speaker and whip counter all at the same time because he's got no margin.
Right. So Tevi, did you want to chime in here a little bit on the process issues?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Again, Rick's making some really good and salient points, but a couple of points about McCarthy and his caucus and the way they work together. First of all, Matt Continetti has made this excellent point that I think McCarthy is the first speaker in this modern era, meaning since the Gingrich Revolution, who really likes his caucus. He spends all his time in their backyards, as Rick said, and he likes the members. He doesn't have this kind of standoffish position towards them. Newt Gingrich was obviously a revolutionary speaker, but he kind of wanted to be president. He wanted to be more than just speaker. And then you obviously had Dennis Hastert, who stepped in when Gingrich failed. And then in more recent years, you had John Boehner, who I think wanted to be Speaker of the House of Representatives in the late 1990s. I mean, there was a disconnect between him and the membership. Obviously, Paul Ryan later became Speaker, and he was kind of roped into it. I mean, he was the one who said he didn't want to be it, and they had to give him all these reasons why he did it. He was the only person who could fit. And so here we have McCarthy, who actually likes his members. He's been talking to them for years. He knows them all well. The reason he's on the road 250 days a year is not just for fundraising, it's for getting to know his members in a real and serious and a deep way. And so he likes the caucus. At the same time, and this is also equally important, is that the caucus recognizes that was going on in the later Obama years when we had a Republican House, but the Democratic president. That approach didn't work when there was no ability to compromise, no ability to stay unified. If you stay unified, you can actually have a strong negotiating position and get stuff done, as McCarthy proved with the debt ceiling. Earlier, Michele, you said it was a crisis. It wasn't a crisis in the sense that we knew what the two outcomes were going to be. If McCarthy could pass something, then he had negotiating standing and he could get something done like he did, which kind of controls spending a little bit. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it actually moves forward on the path that the Republicans are trying to move on. If he couldn't get anything passed from his own caucus, then he had no negotiating standing. And then it was going to be basically Biden and McConnell working out something where it's mostly Democratic votes and no spending changes and no reforms and nothing, just clean debt ceiling. And that was not what the Republicans wanted. So they knew they needed to pass something. They needed to be unified to pass something, even if it wasn't the ideal piece of legislation from everybody's perspective. They needed something in order to be at that negotiating table, and they did it. And so I think that even though there's an article, it seems, every week in NPR or the New York Times or Washington Post, how McCarthy's losing control of his caucus, it's going to collapse. It hasn't happened yet, and I'm not so sure it's going to happen. I think McCarthy knows what he's doing, and I think the members know that if they're not unified, then they won't be able to get anything done. And it's really going to be the Democratic White House and the Schumer-McConnell Senate leading everything.
So I do want to talk about the shutdown threat, because we had the debt ceiling battle. I think part of what everyone had hoped was we had this bipartisan agreement and it would both extend the debt ceiling, but also would fund the government. And now we're faced with this potential for a shutdown because the House, as you said, Rick, is reporting lower numbers than the Senate is. Typically in the past, when these have happened, the media at least, the perception has generally been that Republicans caused this. And I think that certainly is how the administration will spin it. But what happens now? So all of this is really inside baseball. I don't think the vast majority of the public knows or cares about the debt limit or such. But if there's a government shutdown, they're going to feel that. And these policies are going to be felt at home and become very, very real. So can we avoid a shutdown? And if not, how is that going to be seen by the public in terms of political blame, do you think? I don't either one of you.
I'll go real fast. Can we avoid a shutdown? Yeah, I think it's possible. Right now, I think it's 50-50. I do think it's different steps that we take. Look, Tevi made excellent points, and I completely agree with him. Kevin McCarthy is probably the most underrated politician in town and probably the most underrated politician in a decade. I mean, this guy, to Tevi's point, he knows his members. Let's start with that. That's a very, very key foundational point. Why is that important? Because he knows what makes them tick. He knows the interests that they have. He knows what they need to be able to cut the deal. I'll go back to the point I made. They get these appropriations bills done. They've marked to lower levels, so they want to see greater spending cuts. Well, that's going to be their negotiation going into the September discussions. When they're trying to figure out with the Senate and with the White House what the ultimate spending levels are going to be. If we get to September 30, I'm kind of spitballing here, but if we get to September 30 and McCarthy has listened to all of his members, has passed all the House appropriations deals, is trying to leverage and negotiate from a position of strength, I think there's a decent chance that his team will look and say, all right, we're at September 30. Our leadership is still fighting for us. We'll go ahead and kick the can for another 2 weeks or maybe another month and give them some more time to iron it out. I mean, the biggest problem that we face in DC is also the only way anything gets done, which is action forcing events. The only way anything gets done in Washington is because there's a deadline. So September may be too soon to get it locked down. And so that's the reason why you're hearing a lot of the buzz about a shutdown threat. But if they get their approach bills done, if that gives McCarthy the leverage that he needs with the White House and the Senate to ask for even more reduced spending, that's going to be a battle in and of itself. But if he turns to his members who he continues to talk to and meet with every single day, every single week, they may be willing to give him the extra weeks or month or so that he might need to actually seal the deal that can be brokered between the Senate and the White House and the House. So I'm pretty bullish on McCarthy. This guy's always underestimated. It has always been underestimated. And Tevi's point to me is the best one, and that is he likes his members, and the members, for the most part, like him. I mean, are there some folks that aren't best friends with the guy? Probably so, but he still goes and talks to them, and that means something to people, right? He's not ignoring the members of his caucus, and he really can't. I mean, he's got a single-digit margin of error here. I keep going back to that because it's pretty critical. He's got to have all of his guys on board. So it's going to be a very interesting August. There's going to be a lot of discussions, and I got a feeling he's going to be burning up the phones and talking to a lot of his members to try to see where they are heading into September.
Tevi, I know you kind of probably have looked at some of this from a historical perspective. Anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of points on this. Again, agree with Rick. But look, everybody talks about McCarthy, narrow margin, McCarthy can't get stuff done. But McCarthy has that advantage of he likes his members and knows his members. And B, I'm not saying all the members like him, although a lot do. But the other members recognize the need for Republican unity to get stuff done. And nobody talks on the other side. You never hear this in the media. Oh, Chuck Schumer, he's got a narrow majority. He only has 50 seats. What's going to happen if he loses one of his members? And the truth is, in the Senate, it's a tougher job because it's not just a majority to get stuff done. You need that 60. You need those 60 votes, which gives McConnell more of a say on things. And I just don't think that the Washington conversation that we see in the mainstream media is enough about the challenges that Schumer has. So if, as Rick says, McCarthy does his job and gets 13 appropriations bills passed, I think that puts Schumer in a tough spot because he's got a lot of members who aren't going to want to vote for any kind of spending reductions or anything that's not a major spending increase, to be frank. So I think Schumer is facing a real challenge. And I think that the reason we talk about shutdowns and action forcing events is that nobody in the abstract wants to compromise. You come to Washington, you have your principles, you say, I stand for this and I want to get this done. And you only compromise when you are faced with some worse alternative. The worst alternative is government shuts down and suddenly the national parks aren't open and suddenly we're not paying interest on the debt or whatever it is that happens in a shutdown. And the administration has some say in it. Remember, Clinton in the 90s tried to make the shutdowns as painful as possible by choosing the things where the pain was imposed. But it is that fact of the shutdown is what makes people compromise because, well, on the one hand, I don't want to change on my principles or give up anything that I don't want to get. At the same time, I don't want the government to shut down and feel the pain from my constituents. So it is that dynamic that forces them to have these compromises, and that's why action forcing events are the only ways to get action.
Well, I think let's hope you're right. And they kick the can a little bit down the road. And one thing I forgot to mention for our viewers, we will take questions at the end of the program. You can put your questions in the chat if you're watching us over Zoom, or you can use Twitter at BPC_live, and we will take some audience questions in just a little bit. I want to pivot a little bit to broaden this out. So as we all know, we are heading into what promises to be one more very partisan presidential election. And as you know, conventional wisdom in DC is we will pretty much stop working later on this year as the presidential debates heat up. But Tevi, presidents do get some stuff done when they're running for re-election. What can we expect? What has history shown in terms of presidents being able to legislate in that last year right before an election?
Right. So the safest bet is usually that not a lot gets done. The whole attitude in Washington is, okay, we're going to go home and we're not going to do anything that's too risky or too challenging before an election. But that doesn't mean it can't happen. There have been numerous instances where we have had a situation where you have a president and a Congress of different parties where you get stuff done in an election year. And I like to think back to 1996 when I was first starting out in Congress. You had the Bill Clinton administration and you had the Newt Gingrich-led Congress after the Republican Revolution. And they passed welfare reform, and they passed Megan's Law, and they passed HIPAA reform, or HIPAA itself, and telecom reform. So all these things passed in 1996. So that was a pretty eventful law from a eventful year from a legislative perspective. And I think it was because there was a recognition between Clinton and Gingrich. The guys didn't necessarily love each other, and obviously they had some very contentious political fights, and they were willing to go after each other and did. But at the same time, they recognized that it was in both of their political interests to pass something in that election year and throughout the time that they were working together. So it wasn't all antagonistic. It was, what can I give up to get something that I want? And on the other hand, what am I willing to compromise on in order to get more stuff that I want? And so I, again, look at that 1996 year. Obviously, when Obama runs for re-election in 2012, it was a different scenario, and you weren't getting a lot done legislatively that year. And David Letterman had this funny joke in Obama's second term that he goes to get a physical from the doctor, and he, he gets a clean bill of health. And Letterman joked it's the first time he's passed anything in years, because Obama didn't really pass stuff much legislatively after that first initial push. But Clinton was a different creature, a different animal. And I think he and Gingrich, even though they disagreed on a lot of stuff, they came to an understanding on what kind of things they wanted to pass in that year of 1996.
Does that type of relationship, from what I'm picking up from y'all, doesn't really exist right now among McCarthy, Schumer, the Biden administration?
I think it could. Why not? I mean, McCarthy is by all accounts, a very nice guy. I mean, Rick knows him better than I do. I've met him, but Rick knows him better. That his members, most of them seem to like him. Biden was around in 1996. He voted for some of those things that I talked about earlier. He's got a long history of someone who's willing to work on both sides of the aisle. You also had, Mitch McConnell knows how to get a deal done. So I'm not saying it's undoable. I'm just saying that some people are going to have to make some changes. And I think the fact that McCarthy was able to get that debt ceiling package through tells the Democrats that here's a guy who can actually pass stuff. You can't just sit on your hands and wait for him to fail, because he's not going to do it. He's constantly underestimated. And I think that needs to be taken account as you go into this election year. And Biden doesn't want to go face the voters on a record of saying, well, once I lost the House, I couldn't get anything done. You vote for me again. That's not really a good message. So I think there's a possibility that it happens again. I think Biden is certainly more willing, at least reputationally, to negotiate and compromise than his predecessor, Barack Obama. So maybe he could be more like a Clinton than an Obama. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I would, Michele, I just weigh in and say there's going to be some opportunities. There were bipartisan votes for the big infrastructure bill. That also created concern among a lot of conservatives because the size of the spending for that bill, one of the largest that we'd ever passed. But it was monumental. It was a consequential piece of legislation, but then turned right back around and passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed by just one party. That was not something that the Republicans were pretty keen on. As a matter of fact, most of their legislation right now, when they're looking at their tax cut bills on the House side, are paid for by eliminating a lot of the tax credits that were in that proposal. But there's going to be some opportunities, and I think to Tevi's point, that the debt limit deal at least shows that there's a path for bipartisanship to get these things done. They're going to have some larger bills that are probably must pass, but this is a tough time. But I still think you're probably going to see them get through. I mean, the NDAA's passed, the National Defense Authorization Act, the defense bill, has passed for 60 plus years in a row. There's a big farm bill coming due this year. I think it expires in September. There's a lot of discussion about trying to get that moving. The FAA has a big authorization this year. I think it's had a couple of hiccups in Senate Commerce, but it's probably on its way of moving once they resolve a couple of issues. There's two other items that I think would be of real interest. One is there was a down payment on permitting reform. And that's really an issue that Republicans and Democrats really agree on, and the administration, whether it's oil and gas or if it's renewables, wind, solar. It has everything to do with the problems that everybody faces, both in their states and intrastates, in terms of transmission lines, connectivity to the grid, concerns over getting those permits. Some of these projects have been languishing for decades. So there's a lot of goodwill there that's built up. You've got members in the Senate, especially on the Energy Committee and the Environment Public Works Committee, chairs and ranking members that are trying to push something in permitting reform. Garrett Graves and the House team put a down payment on permitting reform. So I think there's opportunity, and there's some buzz. China seems to be everybody's favorite country to take a stick to, and for lots of really great reasons, and understandable. But there's some buzz about trying to stitch back the so-called China bill from last year. As you'll remember, it had several provisions in their trade, all kinds of different enforcement mechanisms, basically our counter to China's Belt and Road. They pulled out the CHIPS Act to juice our semiconductor industry here in the U.S., and a lot of those provisions kind of went by the wayside on the Senate. So there's been some buzz about some bipartisanship, maybe some agreements that could be reached in pushing a bill that addresses some of the issues that we're having with China in a whole host of areas. I don't know how much they can get done in all of those this year, but the fact that everybody's talking about a desire to move forward and working with the administration, I think is positive. And I think a lot of us would like to see that done.
No, I completely agree. It's we actually just had a group of students here, and of course you always get the question about the future of the country and how things are. But there's a lot of really good bipartisan conversations happening on the Hill. And I'll give a shameless plug for BPC for those of you who in the audience who want to learn more about permitting and regulatory reform. We have been in that space for a very long time and have a lot of resources on our website to explain it. But I think the China conversations, the competitiveness, those are some real opportunities that are out there, especially around, the rare earth minerals. And it might be an opportunity to finally do something about mining reform. So I'm actually kind of optimistic, and it may not happen before the end of this session, end of this Congress, but we can lay the groundwork for the next one. So pivoting a little bit again, talk a little bit about the future of the Republican Party. And again, just a quick reminder to our viewers that you can put questions in the chat or again over Twitter at BPC_live. we have seen, as I mentioned before, some of the Republicans who voted for the debt limit are taking heat back home. Then you've got the conservatives in the House very upset about some of the numbers in there. We've had some senators and members censured back home for working across the aisle. What does that, as a bipartisan organization, that's a little troubling, because we actually believe that we get durable policy when the two parties do work together, and that you bring everyone's viewpoints together, and that it just results in better policy that's more reflective of the country. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on the future of where do Republicans go from here, and how is bipartisanship being perceived?
I'll jump in here because when we were pre-gaming this, Rick wasn't too eager to talk about the censoring issue, so I'm happy to. I mean, look at Tom Tillis. He's a smart politician. He's won a couple of times when he's been counted out before, and so maybe has some problems with the party back home. That doesn't mean he can't re-get the nomination. It doesn't mean he can't win re-election again. Look at somebody like Brian Kemp in Georgia. The party apparatus is hostile to him, but he won re-election overwhelmingly. And so I think a smart politician knows how to play that. And sometimes those party censures can help you in the general election. You could say, look, I'm willing to stand against the people in my party who don't want me to make bipartisan compromise, who don't want to stand up for the great institutions of this country. And look, I was willing to do that. Maybe you should cross the aisle and vote for me because maybe my opponent is denying elections. So I think Brian Kemp played it really smart in Georgia. And I think that Tom Tillis can do the same thing. As for the future of the Republican Party, look, there are some divisions, as we've talked about earlier, but there's always been divisions within the Republican Party. In fact, the Reagan coalition was really built on kind of trying to bring together different elements of the coalition, the great fusionist project, as they call it. They took together the foreign policy conservatives and the libertarians and the kind of more religious or social conservatives, and they were all united in their great fear of communism for a variety of reasons. They all brought that to the table, but that led to an issue set that Republicans were on board with in a unified way. In the 80s, it was for lower taxes. All of them were on board with that. They were for taking a tougher stance on crime, and it was for conservative Supreme Court justices, and it was for a tough stance on the Soviet Union. And maybe some of those issues have lost their salience, so we need a different issue set today. But I think there are things that can bring together the disparate elements of the Republican Party and bring a winning coalition together in 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, Michele, look, I was going to just jump in. We were joking about the censure thing, who would take it, Tevi or me. But I think that's a good job, the way you explain it. That's always tough, right? I mean, look, if you're a House member, you're so close to your district. It's reflexive in terms of its politics. It's a shorter term for 2 years. You're always campaigning. Right when you win the election, you have to start raising money for your next election. So there's a certain sensitivity to what's going on back home. Senators are in the same position, but they have 6 years. And, it's tough to be a senator. You're representing the entire state. You've got pockets of moderates in your state, and you've got pockets of liberal Republicans that they have to be responsive to. You've got conservatives. Democrats have got the same on their side. So it's always tough. I'm kind of with Tevi. I'm kind of the Reagan Revolution. That's what got me involved in politics. I always felt like, look, you be principled, you fight for 100% of what you believe. If you get 80%, you shake the other person's hand, you look them in the eye and say, let's go have some dinner. I'm going to talk to you about how I'm going to come after the next 20% tomorrow, and I want to get 100% of that. And you keep chipping away at it. Public policy is an incremental process. It's very rare that we do really huge, big things. And a lot of times they can all be reversed. So I think what helps us work together is the environment we're in right now. There's probably nothing better for the Republican conference, especially in the House. And this seems odd, but it's true. But to have such a slim margin, which does force leadership and each of the different segments of that caucus to talk to each other. It's a lot easier to know not only what you believe, but what the other guy believes if you're talking to each other. How do your arguments work against somebody who has a different viewpoint that might be more moderate in your party or more conservative in your party? Being able to provide process, everybody's playing by the same set of rules, giving everybody a chance to exercise their right to offer amendments. I mean, for a very long time, the House was operated with an iron fist, and you didn't have a chance for amendment. You passed a rule. You felt like that was all rigged. Now you have a chance where you can actually have open debate. You fight for the opportunity to get your voice heard. You have a Democratic vote. It passes or it fails, and then that's attached to the legislation moving. So maybe what's happening right now can create some more muscle memory going forward, so that the sides can all learn to talk and work together. In some ways, that may be the very biggest benefit that comes out of having such a small margin in the House for the majority. So
that's really interesting insights there. I hadn't really considered it that way, but yeah, that would make sense. And I think the same would probably benefit Schumer in the Senate, because they're spanning from very progressives. You have Elizabeth Warren to Joe Manchin. In the Democratic caucus, they're just as divided as the Republican caucuses.
Can I just say in the Senate too, that
Yeah,
Schumer probably has an even bigger problem. I mean, if you're Tester or Sherrod Brown or Joe Manchin or Rosen or others, I mean, you've got some states that are going to be highly competitive. We have been spending a lot of money over the last several years, justifying that money being spent. So these spending cuts and votes on those issues are going to be tough for some of those members. So I find it really interesting, because Schumer may have a bigger problem with states where senators are up for re-election that may lean a little bit more right of center. Whereas if you're a Hakeem Jeffries, you may have you may have a larger progressives that you're having to work with that are kind of pushing the needle in the opposite direction. So the politics on both sides are very unique and interesting.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to echo Rick's good point, which is Schumer has this problem. It may very well be a bigger problem, but nobody talks about it. You're reading these articles every week about McCarthy's on death's door, McCarthy's going to go, and it's not happening. And obviously McCarthy, as we've said, has been doing a good job of holding his caucus together. And nobody talks about these inherent, serious, severe structural problems that Schumer faces. And I think more attention should be paid to it.
good point. Yes, both parties have divisions. It's a very interesting time for politics, and it makes it a little hard for organizations like ours to figure out where the fault lines are, to be honest with you, because the parties are shifting. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because the Republican Party that I grew up with and was more, and I'll just say it was more of the corporate Republican Party. It's the business party. We are now sort of trending more towards the populist end, which had been the Democratic side of things. Those are two very different views of the world. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how we're going to reconcile that. To your point, Rick, like we've got a narrow majority in the House that's going to force some of these conversations where we have to bridge those differences, but the economic one seems pretty big.
Yeah, I'll go real quick on that. Look, the U.S. Chamber serves a great role for businesses across the country, but for the last couple of years, they've been a little bit out of favor with the Republicans. I think that's probably the nice way to say it. But I think where you're going to see potential reconciliation is at more the state and local level. So I don't know if people saw this. I found it fascinating, but Texas and Arizona is an example. Their state chambers have come up in the last several months and have met directly with House Republican leadership. They're trying to meet with the White House and the presidency, and they're talking about issues like immigration that really impact those states. And so you get chambers in the states themselves that are taking a more active role. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw the business interests in other specific states start to lean in more and work with their own state delegation to try to focus on those issues that are important to the business community back home. I'm not saying they're doing that because it needs to replace something like the U.S. Chamber, which we're just using here as an example. But I think it probably is something that members would be very responsive to. I always felt, at least as a chief of staff, there were a lot of folks on K Street that would come around and see me representing various interests, and we always wanted to hear what they had to say. But if I had a local chamber come up, a group of businesswomen and businessmen come talk to us, or a local group of interested citizens on an issue, that was pretty important. That translated into The viewpoint back home, it translated into votes. It was a bellwether of where people were. So maybe states and locals can start to help out and provide a little bit more of an engine for direction of where business interests should go, working with members. I think it winds up finding its way back, but I will tell you, a lot of the energy, at least in the Republican Party on the conservative side, tends to be on a lot of these social and cultural issues right now. They seem to be more in the forefront of the minds of not only the voting public back home in each of these different districts and in many states, but the politicians themselves. I don't think that the Republican Party is going to not pay attention to business interests. It's kind of in our DNA. We believe in lower taxes and greater freedoms and less regulation. So I don't think that we will abandon the corporate community or business interests. But I do think that right now, some of the hottest topics are more in the social and cultural arena. I do think it's important for state chambers and state businesses to be weighing in. And I would think groups, whether it be the U.S. Chamber or others up here, should be relying on some of their state and local leaders to kind of work with those members to kind of put their priorities, back in line and up at the top of the agenda.
Great. So I do want to we've got one question from Twitter I want to throw out here because I think it speaks to what you're talking about here, Rick. It says Americans in poll after poll say that they support more of a social agenda item such as taxing the wealthy, childcare, minimum wage, better healthcare, and so on. Conservatives do not seem to want these issues addressed, and they want to know why. But I would argue that, and I'm curious your thoughts, we are actually seeing more Republicans, more conservatives looking at things like childcare and paid leave, in part because they're hearing from businesses that they can't find workers. And one of the biggest reasons we can't find workers is the lack of affordable childcare. And so I think some of these issues are becoming more, that you're finding more Republicans and conservatives willing to engage on that. I don't know that about the taxing the wealthy part, but I'm curious if you've got any thoughts on some of those other issues that Republicans are starting to engage more on.
Yeah, look,
I
go real fast. Yeah, family medical leave is something that is a bipartisan issue, and you're going straight to it, which is it's hard for employers to find workers. I mean, workers have multiple options. You have to appeal to them now for the things that they're looking for: higher quality of life. We've just come out of COVID. I saw an article yesterday that employers were having a real problem of getting their workers in on Mondays. They wanted to jumpstart Mondays and get things going, and a lot of the workers were not as interested in coming back on Mondays, would prefer to do more telework. Whatever your opinion is on that, it's a reality for the employers. So I think the more you can be responsive to the needs of that individual or their families, it's going to be better off for you as an employer, so that you can continue to have a healthy workforce and be responsive to what they're looking for. You've got all kinds of leadership in the Republican Party on things like family medical leave. So that's a good example. Another issue is the environment. We have lots of differences with progressives and liberals on environmental issues, but the largest and growing population of the younger members of our party, the Republican Party, all want us to do something about the environment. They want to see us moving towards a renewable energy focus. They would like to see us focus on conservation. It's important to some of the younger voters. That's the reason why you're seeing a lot of senators taking leadership roles, because they're hearing from either their kids or some of their younger supporters back home. So, I mean, I think there are these opportunities to find bipartisanship. And I think that the party, it's not that the party is changing, it's just that there are different demands and different interests from the folks that are in our party that are either focused on the different benefits that they need in the workplace, or things like an agenda on the environment that they think would make sense at the same time, without moving so fast beyond our means to electrify the country and get the country moving, et cetera.
Great.
A couple quick thoughts
Tevi,
on
did you
that.
want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, so look, there are changes within the party, especially Michele, you're talking about the party when you were growing up. Obviously, the voter base used to be a much more college educated voter base for Republicans, and now it's a little less likely to be college educated. We can talk about what kids are learning in college that makes that happen, and I think that fits into the social issues that Rick was talking about. So I think that's part of it. In terms of taxing the wealthy, I think Republicans recognize that you can't just impose confiscatory taxes on the wealthiest people, and that won't solve our $30+ trillion debt problem. So I think we need to have a smarter solution for how to resolve that issue. Just maybe it's a good talking point for Bernie Sanders, but I don't think it's a winning issue or a working issue. It's not a workable issue. So I think we need to think about what that agenda is that I talked about earlier. What are the unifying parts of the Republican agenda? I know a couple of things. Republicans tend to be anti-woke. We can talk about what the definition of that is. They're concerned about the bias in the mainstream media. They're for conservative judges and Supreme Court justices. They happen to be generally very pro-Israel. They're increasingly concerned about China. So I think all of these are elements of what could potentially be a unifying vision for what Republicans are. And I think the person who figures that out is in the best position to win the 2024 Republican nomination. And with a vulnerable, aging Democrat in the White House, I think has a real opportunity to win the presidency back for the Republican Party.
Great. So I know we're coming up on time. I want to kind of end us with a more hopeful note about the future. So obviously, it's going to be challenging with a presidential election. Every politics always gets amplified, but people, the sense is now people feel like we are more divided than we have ever been. I'm not sure that bears out in the data, but obviously there is a lot of partisanship filtering all the way down to local school boards. But is there a path forward to a more normal, however you want to define normal, system where people can get back to what you both have described, where you disagree, but then you go have a coffee together, or you can just learn to live next to your neighbor who might have different political views rather than moving to a community where everyone agrees with you? Like, is there a path forward for some of that reconciliation?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've been that pessimistic in this conversation. I think Rick and I both have some optimism about us. And, Rick and I didn't agree on everything. So I'm going to, take the first step and invite him out for coffee. We're going to have coffee together sometime after we do this panel. I know we're both in the same party, but, maybe from different wings, or we've had different experiences. So yeah, I'm all for getting together for coffee. I think polls show that there are about 8% of the American people who are far, far to the left and radical, and they don't want any compromise, and about 6 people equivalent on the right. And so that's 14% of the people who just want to see fighting and drum banging and the kind of anger you see on some of the cable TV networks, although not this one. Thank you, C-SPAN. But I think that means that there's 86% of the American people who just want Congress to get the job done, who want the president not to be calling names to get stuff done. And I think that they want to live their lives and be happy about their lives and recognize that we live in the best country in the world. And look, Rick and I were both on the Hill in the 1990s. There was a lot of partisanship back then. There was a lot of contentiousness back then. Well, we had impeachment hearings back then. So it's not like there's ever been a period in America where everybody's in agreement and everything's kumbaya. So it is a system that by its nature has people disagreeing on big issues, and it's in part based on where you live in this country. It's in part based on what kind of education you have. It's in part based on your background. Where did you come from? What country were you from? What part of the world are you from before you came here? And so I think there are reasons that there are disagreements. And I think some of the disagreements are sharper in the last 30 years because we have better flow of information and we've had a great demographic sort. So people who lived in the South and might have been legacy Democrats for a long time those people are now basically Republicans. And people who lived in the North and were kind of Northeastern liberal Republicans, those people are now basically Democrats. So you don't have those mixes within the localities to the extent you did. But it's still the same basic issues that people disagree on, and also the same basic issue that most of us, at least I would say 86% agree on, which is that this is a great country with great institutions and systems for figuring it out, and we need to respect those institutions. We need to respect those systems. And that's really what BPC, what Bipartisan Policy Center, is all about. Let's have a conversation where both sides can recognize that there are ways in which we discuss and challenge and solve problems in this country, and they have to be via those institutions. You can't go institutional on us. You can't tear down the institutions. You need to be part of the American system, the American way of deciding things. And I am optimistic that we can get back to a better place, or at least recognizing that people always seem to be pessimistic about where they are. And in 2040, people might say, hey, those 2020s were pretty good.
Yeah, can I just add, look, I mean, our politics has always been a little bit salty. I don't know that there's any one decade that's been tougher or nicer than the other. I mean, you can just kind of goes up and down depending upon your perspective. But let's use Tevi's percentages. The 84% of folks that aren't the 16 that seem to be upset and mad at everything. To me, the most important thing is folks shouldn't be canceling other people out. Everybody has a right to their opinion, whether that's in the classroom, more of these types of discussions on the Senate floor, on the House floor. Everybody's entitled to have an opinion, and everybody should be respectful and listen to what the other person has to say. I only know why I feel the way I do as a conservative if I'm talking to a liberal. If I'm only talking to other conservatives, then I'm in my own echo chamber and I just think I'm the brightest guy in the world because everything I say is right. I mean, I get challenged every time I have a chance to talk to somebody who has a different opinion than I have. I'm just hopeful that, and I should be respectful for what they say, and I'd like to make sure that they're doing the same thing with me. So to me, the biggest issue is I'd love that 84% to make a demand on America that the 16% are not going to control our politics. That they're not going to control what people have to say. And both sides on both extremes do this. And I think that everybody else that's in the very swath of the middle that includes conservatives to liberals are willing to listen to each other. And that's the only way our politics in general are going to get better. That's the only way more bipartisan legislation is going to pass. You have to listen to the person that's across the seat from you. And that's critically important, I think, now more than ever in our politics.
Well, that is a great note to end on, and I 100% agree with you. I would love to find a way to get that 84%, those viewpoints amplified a little bit, because I do think that they really are obviously the majority of the country and where people want us to be. So thank you both. This was a really great conversation. I so appreciate it. Thank you to our audience today. Thank you to C-SPAN for covering us. And please stay tuned at BPC bipartisanpolicy.org for more great bipartisan content. Thank you both.